Yes, Elon Musk is out $1 billion or whatever he's going to be out, and I'm sure he'll have another billion. But the people who are hurt by this are people who don't have access to internet.
Look at what's happened since then. There has been just a deluge of what the Wall Street Journal has called regulatory harassment. You got the DOJ going after him, Southern District of New York, the FAA, the Federal Trade Commission, even the Fish and Wildlife Service going after him. Now you've got the FCC to add onto that pile of agencies that's going after Elon Musk. And it seems very clear to me that if Starlink was owned by someone other than Elon Musk or someone with different politics than Elon Musk, they would still have that $1 billion. All
right, folks, it is Thursday, the Thursday following Christmas. I hope you've not just unpacked all of those great gifts, but taken back what you need to get, maybe settled in a little, getting your New Year's plans ready to go. Well, we have a great show headed your way. The government, under Joe Biden's direction, and this isn't like some conspiracy theory, he literally stood in front of the press corps and said, let's go after Elon Musk. And the message came through loud and clear. Agencies from the Fish and Wildlife Service to the Federal Communications Commission decided, we got it, boss. We're going after Elon Musk. But what he did and how he did it, how they did it is unbelievable. They're literally targeting him because they don't like what he's doing at the expense of providing the internet to a lot of low-income people and people who have a hard time accessing it. We're going to go through that with Brendan Carr, a commissioner of the FCC, a great conversation about the rules, the regulations, what we're up against with respect to big tech and so much more. Let's get into it. Commissioner Carr, good to see you. I hope you had a good Christmas.
Very, very good. So good to be with you, Sean. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so let me just start this conversation off in a sort of a get to know you kind of way. What does the FCC have jurisdiction over for people who are wondering what it does and does not have the authority to regulate?
Yeah, too many things at this point. I think we have jurisdiction over too many. So the FCC is we'll call an independent regulator here in DC. It's a 5-member body. So 3 commissioners are of the president's political party. So right now 3 are Democrats and there's 2 of us that are Republicans. So I'm the senior Republican, and the FCC regulates everything from wireless service to the cell phone carriers that are out there. We make the airwaves available for them. We can also help make it easier or harder to build out infrastructure. We also obviously regulate the airwaves, so radio and television. We do public safety as well. We've done a lot of activity, for instance, on national security, including Huawei and ZTE. So it's a really interesting time at the FCC where we cover a lot of interesting issues.
But let me get this straight. Do you guys, I know you have authority over, so NBC, ABC, the public airwaves. What about cable?
Yeah, we don't impose content regulations on cable. So for instance, on broadcast TV and broadcast radio, we have certain sort of older content rules. So indecency, obscenity, those regulations. And then, the FCC licenses those broadcast TV and broadcast radio stations. So once every 8 or 10 years, those licenses will come due, and the FCC has to decide whether that licensee has been operating in what we call the public interest. And that can be, a thorough review or a pretty light review.
All right, folks, now more than ever, it's smart to be ready in case of an unpredictable health emergency, right? Now more than ever, imagine that a health crisis strikes and the usual channels for medication are disrupted. Sound familiar? Hello, 2020. That's where contingency medical comes into play, providing you access to emergency packs of antibiotics for ordinary ailments like urinary tract infections, ear infections, strep throat, and so much more. Think about being ready for that unexpected that we all know is potentially around the corner. Contingency Medical even has symptom management medicines for everything from nausea to diarrhea, motion sickness, ensuring that you're up to date. You need to be ready in case something bad happens. You don't want to be running around trying to find out that everyone at pharmacy is out of something that you can't get in touch with your doctor. I've got some free samples of their Ready Pack Plus. I know that if something happens, I'm ready to go. Contingency Medical also offers free shipping on all packs. Prepare yourself and your family in case something goes wrong. So don't wait. Go to contingencymedical.com/Spicer now and enter promo code Spicer for $20 off. $20 off your pack. Any pack that you pick at Contingency Medical, right? So go to contingencymedical.com/Spicer. Use that promo code Spicer. And remember, Contingency Medical and its products are not intended as a substitute for professional medical treatment or advice. You should always consult with your healthcare provider. when it comes to the cable world, like either the distributors or the stations, the CNNs, the Foxes? What do you guys have jurisdiction over anything to do with them?
No, not really. The FCC doesn't license them, and so our jurisdiction over them, if any, is very, very light. It's different than, as you point out, with licensed radio or licensed TV that have to come and get a license from the FCC and get it renewed. We don't license cable stations that way.
So when we hear about things like equal time that says, hey, if NBC covers, Joe Biden for 20 minutes, they have to cover Donald Trump or something like that. The cable companies don't have to abide by those same kind of restrictions.
Yeah, those rules historically never really applied in the cable context, or now what we call sort of online or streaming or podcasts. Obviously, they just applied historically to broadcast radio and broadcast TV. But even now, almost all those rules have slowly been unwound. Principally, they came out on First Amendment grounds. In fact, the Fairness Doctrine, probably the most well-known of all those types of rules, was pulled back by the FCC in the 1980s. And really, if you think about it, the Fairness Doctrine wasn't very fair to conservatives. It ended up with a lot of bias that came as a result of that decision. So I think it's good that that one's been in the rearview mirror for a little bit of time now.
So I know there was a lot of discussion when Elon Musk took over Twitter, now called X. You were very outspoken about that acquisition. Supportive of Elon Musk, because I think generally, like a lot of people on the right, recognize that this was good for free speech. But obviously, you shared publicly some concerns about the government going after Elon Musk, saying that Biden had almost targeted Elon Musk.
Yeah, I think this is a real pattern that we're seeing. So just recently at the FCC, we voted as a commission. It was a 3-2 party line vote to revoke a nearly $1 billion infrastructure award that we had provisionally given to Elon Musk's Starlink back in 2020. This was actually part of a $9 billion initiative that we launched actually alongside President Trump back in 2020 to make sure that rural America would get high-speed internet service. And
so what is Starlink? Yeah, explain that for a minute.
Yeah, so Starlink is this new generation of low Earth orbit satellites that's ultimately owned by Elon Musk. There's about 5,000 of these satellites up there. And it's not like the traditional satellite that people may have been familiar with for, generations, which was, if it provided internet at all, it was slow. This new generation of low Earth orbit satellites, the system called Starlink, is providing very high speed, what we call 100 megabit per second over 20 megabit per second. So really quality high-speed internet service. It's being used here in the U.S., but it's also probably well known to people because it's something that's being relied on in war zones across the world. So the Ukrainian government has been relying on Starlink as one example to keep their internet connectivity up and running during that conflict over there. So Starlink is this system that's first been licensed back in 2019 that's been underway now for a couple of years.
So it's interesting. I mean, for people who, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your world, not mine, but so most people are used to getting their internet from like Comcast or Fios or what have you, right? But if you don't live in an urban area, especially people out in the Midwest or whatever, they'll get it from a satellite. Is that right?
Potentially, yeah. There's a couple of interesting, competing technologies. As you noted out, most people probably are familiar with wired cable or wired fiber, those types of connections that offer really high-speed service. But this new generation of low Earth orbit satellite is one that's essentially providing close to fiber-like speeds, close to cable-like speeds, but delivered directly from a satellite. And you'll get one of those, dishes that are small that you can actually just place on a table or at a location outside. And you can get, again, virtually overnight, high-speed service where it might take a fiber provider years and years to, trench the fiber and pull the conduit and eventually get to you. So it's a really good new competitive development that consumers like. And Starlink's not the only one. Actually, Amazon is in the process of launching their own satellite system called Kuiper. So we're optimistic there'll be some competition there as well.
Okay, so what's the rub with Elon? He has Starlink. It's providing this internet service. You guys award a contract. What's the beef?
Yeah, so back in 2020, we held this award open, and Starlink won about almost $1 billion to bring high-speed service to something like 640,000 homes and locations in rural America spread across 35 states. All was going well. And then flash forward to this recent FCC decision, and the FCC effectively revoked that $1 billion award under a decision that just does not withstand scrutiny under the law or the facts or policy. At its core, the FCC said, we don't think that Starlink is that reliable of a technology such that we should allow them to continue to have this $1 billion. But that doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons. One, the U.S. government right now is entering into multi-million-dollar contracts with Starlink to provide our military with connectivity. So when it absolutely matters the most, the government's relying on Starlink. So this idea that it wasn't a reliable technology didn't make sense. In fact, I think the only way to think about this FCC decision is to go back a year ago to the White House. President Biden stood behind the podium, adorned with the official seal of the President of the United States, and he said that Elon Musk is worth looking into. And then a reporter asked how. The president looked down and he said, there's a lot of ways. And there certainly are. Look at what's happened since then. There has been just a deluge of what the Wall Street Journal has called regulatory harassment. You got the DOJ going after him, Southern District of New York, the FAA, the Federal Trade Commission. You've got even the Fish and Wildlife Service going after him. Now you've got the FCC to add onto that pile of agencies that's going after Elon Musk. And it seems very clear to me that if Starlink was owned by someone other than Elon Musk or someone with different politics than Elon Musk, they would still have that $1 billion. And it's not really about
you got
Elon.
this 4 other colleagues. When you go to them and say, hey, guys, this looks a little fishy, do they say anything?
Well, this was 3-2. So my fellow Republican, Commissioner Simonton, dissented along with me. And my Democrat colleagues, they're good people, but I guess we just didn't see eye to eye on this one. And it's funny, too, because, it's not like Elon Musk really is the one that's hurt by this. Okay, he doesn't get $1 billion, but he's got enough money. But it's rural America that ends up bearing the brunt
but that's
of it.
what I'm saying, though, that it's not, when you say they're good people, right? Or you don't see eye to eye. Eye to eye is, hey, I want to go to this restaurant. You want to go to that restaurant. I want to spend $10. You want to spend $20. When you said to them, hey, guys, we voted on this. We awarded him $1 billion. There's no reason to, that's what I don't get. That's not seeing eye to eye. That's literally going after someone with a political vendetta.
Look, I think that's the only pattern here that makes sense. Because again, it's not just this one FCC decision, it's all these others. And you could say, well, Elon Musk does a lot of business and therefore he's going to run in with the government a lot. Okay, I get that. But look individually at all of these cases. You had the NLRB going after Tesla, Elon Musk's Tesla, for dress code violations. Okay. You had the Federal Trade Commission going after to try to get the identity of journalists that were getting access to information as part of the Twitter files reveal. You had the Fish and Wildlife Service that went after him because there was reportedly a handful of bobwhite quail eggs and some blue land crabs that got charred as a result of a SpaceX launch. To me, that sounds more like surf and turf than a federal case.
All right, folks, are you looking to secure your financial future? I know I was, right? You've got real estate, maybe some stocks, bunch of other things, a 401k, an IRA. But how are financial metals part of that? Because you look at the price of gold, the price of silver, so many of the other precious metals, how they've done over time. It's a smart bet. And the folks at Bishop Gold Group can sit down with you and talk to you about how to convert an IRA, a 401, whatever it is. Just make it part of your planning. I did it. I sat down. I talked to them about what made sense for me. I got precious metals as part of my portfolio now. And here's the thing. You can keep them. They can keep them. You will sit down with the folks at Bishop Gold Group and come up with a plan that's right for you, depending on how much you have, what you want, where you want to store it. Whenever you're ready to cash it in, you call them back and say, hey, here's what I have. I need to cash it out. They'll make that happen. That's the beauty. These are folks that I know, that I trust, that I talk to. So if you want to join me, then go to bishopgoldgroup.com/Sean. You get a special promotion for kicking off your journey to financial freedom and diversification with Bishop Gold Group and precious metals. Or you can call 844-984-1616. But go to bishopgoldgroup.com/Sean to see how you can make precious metals part of your financial freedom journey. Thanks. This isn't some massive commission. There's 3 Democratic members. Don't you at some point just say to them, I don't know their names. Hey, Bob, Susie, what's going on? Right? Doesn't that just at some point you say, can you guys explain why we're here? Why are we doing this? What is the grounds for this action that we want to take? That's what I don't get. If this was 10,000 people, I'd say, okay, it's a bureaucracy. There's 3 people that are driving this train.
Yeah, that's right. Look, Sean, have you heard the analogy of the the turtle and the scorpion. So the scorpion goes to the turtle and says, "Hey, will you give me a ride across the pond?" And the turtle says, "Nah, I don't think so, because you're gonna sting me and we're gonna drown and it's not gonna be good." And the scorpion says, "No, I'd never sting you when you're giving me a ride. If I did, we'd both drown." And so the turtle reluctantly lets him get on his back and he's swimming him across the pond. They get to the deep middle and the scorpion stings the turtle and they both start to sink and drown. And the turtle says, "Why'd you do that?" And the scorpion looks up with his last breath and says, "It is my nature." And so I think that's a lot of what we do at the end of the day is, I don't blame people for necessarily their political or ideological leanings. But again, it's very clear to me that a pattern of regulatory harassment has emerged across all of these agencies.
But the thing that is interesting, and you brought this up, is yes, Elon Musk is out $1 billion or whatever he's going to be out, and I'm sure he'll have another billion. But the people who are hurt by this are people who don't have access to the internet. Now, a lot of those people probably don't live in areas that vote for Democrats. Maybe that's it. But why would you intentionally? And it's not like, is there a competitor that's going to replace them? Some union shop that's going to help him? Because I don't understand why you intentionally hurt him when you're really hurting Americans that don't have access. And all these people whine and moan about access to good internet, learning, the gap that exists between people who the haves and the have-nots. It's like, this isn't hurting Elon Musk or rich people. This is hurting people who need access to this.
Yeah, you're right. And look, there is another component of this, which is the Biden administration right now has their own $40 billion broadband internet initiative called Internet for All. And so now these areas that were going to get serviced by Starlink, they're not going to get anything right now, but they now become eligible for service through that Biden administration program. And notably, as you sort of indicated, that Biden program is a union initiative. It relies very heavily on union labor to dig all that fiber. And so there's that element as well that's out there. And so, it's a tough one. But look, also the taxpayer is the one that gets hit. So the subsidy that we were going to provide at the federal government to Starlink to connect these 640,000 people was going to be about $1,300 per household. The Biden administration's plan, because they use union labor, because it has this fiber preference as opposed to being technology neutral, there's estimates there that it's going to cost almost $5,000 per household. And so it's going to be a significant hit to the American taxpayer. If we do, in fact, provide service to these people again, these rural communities, we're going to be doing so in a much more expensive way. And also, look, separately, too, here's another point. We need to be sort of backing American innovators and entrepreneurs because China is launching their own version of this low Earth orbit satellite system. Obviously, China always, copies and steals technologies from other leaders. Their technology is not called Starlink; it's called Starnet. So very similar, and that could be
it's not McDonald's; it's McDonald's.
Yeah, exactly, and that could be up and running by 2028. And think about that for a second from a geopolitical perspective, that China is going to have the capacity to deliver high-speed internet service anywhere in the globe, potentially starting as early as 2028. And you think about that tied in with Belt and Road and tied in with the fact that when China provides internet connectivity, it'll come with their internet content filters and moderation policies. And so I think as a country, we start to stare down 2028 and these Chinese competitors to Starlink, it's more reason why we need to have the back of American entrepreneurs today.
Well, and to your point, it's not like they're going to offer it cheap. It's like Huawei computers, right? They'll offer it cheap. It'll suck up our data. They'll be able to turn off and on when they want. They will continue to control us. This is, again, I laugh sometimes. If it wasn't so sad, it would be funny. This idea that we talk about the threat that China poses, and yet we hurt options that will allow us to free ourselves from China. Instead, we're giving them a foothold, to your point, in the next year and a half or whatever. When they launch this, it's going to come in dirt cheap. Americans are going to suck it up because they do. And then they're going to figure out how to, A, control us, and B, suck up more of our data.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And again, I think when you go back to, that White House podium with Biden standing there, and again, in my read, very clearly giving the green light to bureaucrats across D.C., the administrative state, to go after Elon Musk. Again, I don't think you can separate that from views on the left about free speech. The idea that Elon Musk is going to open up and did open up Twitter X to a greater diversity of views is something that is not looked upon very favorably. But it's odd to me too, because if you go back, a short period of time in our political lives, the idea of free speech and diversity of views was a very progressive view. In fact, I'll give you these two bookend events. Back in 2012, right around the election, President Obama went to Facebook's Silicon Valley headquarters and he gave a speech there about the then emerging free flow of information on social media, on the internet. And President Obama described it as, quote, part of what makes for a healthy democracy. Now, flash forward just 10 years, 2022, President Obama went a couple miles down the road to Stanford University and gave a very different speech about the free flow of information on the internet. In fact, he described it as, quote, a threat to our democracy. So think about those two bookend events. President Obama 2012, President Obama 2022, going from the free flow of information is makes for a healthy democracy to our threat to a threat to our democracy. Well, what happened between those two events? Well, it was the 2016 election. And I think this idea that the free flow of information, this idea that we can get around media gatekeepers, that we can get around take makers and people can discuss ideas for themselves has, unfortunately, as a cultural matter, been viewed as a real threat by what used to be the staunchest defenders of free speech in this country, the left. And again, I don't think you can separate that dynamic from what we're seeing at the FCC, the NLRB, Fish and Wildlife Service, all the way down.
So speaking of free speech and these platforms, when this thing was all in its infancy, back in the 90s, there was an act in Congress in 1996 that had a provision in it. It's widely known within the industry as Section 230. And This is how internet companies are judged, right? And it specifically talks about their liability. So right now they're treated as publishers, right? So they can't be sued. They enjoy a ton of protection. But they're not. And that's the thing that's really interesting about this. Explain to people what the battle is over Section 230.
Yeah, Section 230 is really interesting. It does two main things for purposes of this discussion. One thing, Section 230C1, it effectively says that if you as a social media company leave someone else's speech up on your website, you're not liable for that speech if it happens to be tortious or libelous or otherwise sort of unlawful in some way. That's actually a good provision because it encourages people to leave speech up there. You can argue that there's some unbalance there because traditional newspapers don't have that type of protection. But the real problem with 230 is the second piece, which is 230C2, which has been read by courts to say, not only are you fine if you leave speech up, but you can censor speech, carte blanche, however you want, and you're not liable at all for that either. And I think that's the real mistake because it ends up putting a thumb on the scale towards censorship.
So why was it done? It wanted what was the intention when it was?
The idea back in the 1990s, this is when you had the Prodigy messaging boards, as you sort of indicated. And the idea was that you'd have an individual moderator that'd be making sort of an individual decision. Okay, I'm going to take this particular speech down or that particular speech down. But it was a very light form of moderation. It was not a provision that was passed with these, massive machine learning, these algorithms that we have today. And so it's sort of a provision that maybe made sense back in the 1990s, but it's not fit for the technology. And what it's ended up doing is giving this bonus statutory protection in favor of censorship. So I've long been of the view that we need to do something about that. Look, keep 230C1 or some provision like that, but we don't need to have a statutory thumb on the scale in favor of censorship. And this other thing with censorship too is that I think we have to keep an eye on is this, which is it's not necessarily a question about should this speech be silenced or not. I think you can have that debate. It's really a question about where does that silencing take place? And my view is that you should empower individuals that are participating in the digital town square to decide for themselves. If you want to mute someone or not follow someone or block certain words, you should do it. But this idea that we should have someone centralized in Silicon Valley or the government deciding who should censor, it's a mistake. And it's a mistake because it's a system-wide error. If you get it wrong, if you get the New York Post Hunter Biden story wrong, if you get it wrong about, the costs and benefits of masking for young kids with speech, if you get those things wrong at a centralized point in the system, then there's a real harm that comes from that. And so what we need to be doing instead is getting, Facebook and Twitter out of the censorship game itself, empower individual users. And I think that's a much better environment, let alone what we've seen now from what Chairman Jordan and others have exposed in terms of the Biden administration courting directly with Silicon Valley to censor speech. We've got to get away from that.
So just to be clear, if the Washington Post and the New York Times or NBC says something or censors something, they can, legal action could be taken against them. But right now, a Facebook, you can't. Is that right?
That's right. That's part of the way that 230 works. And again, it's not necessarily what Congress meant, but it's been sort of expansively interpreted by the courts over the years. And it needs to be hewed back to either its language by the FCC, which we could do, or fundamentally reformed, which is requiring an act of Congress.
And is that breakdown entirely on ideological or party lines?
It's probably right. I mean, look, as a general matter, when you talk about content moderation or speech, Republicans and Democrats are both unhappy about the status quo, but we tend to be pulling on opposite ends of the same thread. Republicans tend to want more speech, less censorship, and Democrats tend to want more censorship, what they would call, hate speech controls and things like that. So it does, unfortunately, break down a lot by party line when it comes to these types of reforms on 230.
So why, like, for example, under the Trump administration, we had the House and the Senate, full trifecta there. Why didn't something get done either legislatively or within the FCC itself?
Look, it's a real good question. I think part of it is that this was an issue where President Trump was ahead of the curve. He saw the problem that was emerging from censorship on social media. The center of the House and the Senate at the moment, back then, really wasn't there, but it is now. And then President Trump had the Commerce Department late in 2020 file a petition for rulemaking at the FCC, which our then chair, Ajit Pai, put out for comment, which would have reformed Section 230, but January 20 rolled around before there was much progress made on that effort. So I think we're at a point in time now where, again, it was a very sort of leading edge, ahead of the curve issue for the first 2 years, 3 years of the Trump administration. But now I think it's table stakes. I think you now have a critical mass of conservatives, that run the gamut of the party that are realize that we have to fundamentally reform Section 230 in order to make sure that there's the free flow of information on the internet.
So Trump wins, or any other Republican for that matter, and takes back over. You guys go back in the majority. How high is that on the priority list?
Yeah, I think it's up there. I think, we have to find a way to rein in big tech. I think Section 230 is, a top 3 issue when it comes to that. I think there's other issues we need to tackle in parallel, including on some national security issues where we need to go back on, TikTok. That's not necessarily going to be an FCC issue. Maybe it's FTC, maybe it's Congress, but national security, reining in big tech. I think those are going to be the top issues that an FCC, whenever the votes are there, should hit the ground running on.
And is there agreement, do you think, or would that be a litmus test, would you imagine, for someone's confirmation of where they stood on Section 230?
I think that there's a critical mass, when you're talking about Republicans in particular, that, understand and are committed to Section 230 reform. I think, the party has moved pretty significantly on that issue compared to 2 or 3 years ago. So I think almost anybody at this point would agree and understand that we need to do 230 reform.
All right, folks, longtime listeners to the show are going to know about Delta Rescue, deltarescue.org, the largest no-kill sanctuary in the world. It was founded by my friend Leo Grillo, and Leo basically one day found a Doberman that was in need of serious health and nutrition. He rescued that Doberman. He named the Doberman Delta. Delta stands for dedication and everlasting love to animals. It's become Leo's mission and what Delta Rescue does every single day for all sorts of animals. Go to deltarescue.org. Take a look at the videos and the material there. They rely solely on our contributions. If you're an animal lover, go check out deltarescue.org and tell me that you just can't see what great work they do and why we should be helping them. I've rescued 3 dogs myself. I know what it's like to go out there and help them. This is a no-kill sanctuary for life. It's a mission for them, and they rely solely on our contributions. So $5, $10, $100, whatever you can give is super helpful. But more importantly, Leo wants to make this an enduring cause, something that we don't have to worry about just funding month to month, year to year, forever, to make sure that the work of Delta Rescue lives on. They've got an estate planning package on their website, deltarescue.org. Aside from the videos and all the testimonials, go check out that estate planning guide and see if you can make it part of your enduring mission when you pass to make Delta Rescue part of your estate planning. Check it out, download it. It's all free. They can help you walk through it. Please visit deltarescue.org. If you're an animal lover like me, you're going to want to do this. Thank you. I know this sounds kind of in the weeds, but what would be the difference between what the FCC could do within itself and what Congress might want to do? Like, is there a daylight between that because one is a legislative fix and one is sort of a regulatory fix?
Yeah, that's right. At the FCC, we can interpret the words in Section 230, meaning we could say, look, courts have interpreted the C2 exemption, this carte blanche for censoring speech too broadly. It actually only is going to apply to a narrower set of cases. But we can't eliminate the exception altogether. So Congress could come in and say, look, 230 no longer applies at all to taking down speech. We could just come in and say it still applies there because the statute is fairly clear about that, but it applies to a narrower number of cases. So you would see less censorship, but to get fully where we need to go, you need to amend the law, and Congress would have to do that.
So when you guys engage with these big tech firms, especially Meta, Facebook, where do they come down on this? Are they opposed to it? Do they want more? Do they want to get out of this business? Do they like the protection? What is their thinking on this?
It's a mix. You'll see some entities, I think Meta, Facebook is part of these, that has sort of themselves advocated for 230 reform. Of course, they want it to be of a particular variety of 230 reform that works for them. Whenever you sort of impose new regulations, sometimes the incumbent tries to take control of those reforms and make it so it's easy for them and harder for a new entrant. So I think it's a mixed bag, but net, we have to figure out the right path forward. That's going to promote speech and isn't going to be something that simply, solidifies Facebook or some other social media companies' current advantage, so we can have smaller startups continue to emerge and compete.
And is there daylight between, say, Facebook, Google, Twitter? I mean, are they all sort of vote in block on where they want to end up, or is it each company's got a different view?
I think they're largely in the same spot. Facebook stood up this, what they call sort of their internal Supreme Court, which is, both part of them and they claim not part of them, to try to give them some separation from some of these content moderation decisions. But in the main, they all sort of ride together. In fact, when you see state laws, state efforts to effectively do their own version of reforming Section 230. So you had Florida do this, you had Texas do this. Ultimately, the trade association that represents all those companies gets together and challenges those laws, almost regardless of the specific flavor of reform that's at issue.
It's funny though. I've watched a lot of the hearings that Congress has held on this, and we heard terms like shadow banning and censorship. It always seems to go in one direction, and I can never find an instance where somebody on the left says, yeah, I got screwed, I got banned, here's a topic that didn't come up. Every single major instance that I've ever heard of is somebody on the right being locked out, shut out, censored, taken down, blocked. And there's always a random excuse like, oh, we didn't mean it, or that was the algorithm. But it seems very one-sided, and I don't think that that's debatable.
Yeah, look, I think the revelations that have come to light, particularly, again, the work that, Chairman Jordan and others have done to expose the close coordination between the Biden administration and Silicon Valley towards censoring Americans, protected free speech rights, is concerning. In the Twitter files and, similar files that we've seen now on other social media platforms are concerning. And you're right. I do think the censorship tends to cut one way, but it's a challenge for the country, because the way we solve big problems is by talking about them, is about airing perspectives, looking at it from every single possible angle. And if we're being censored or self-censoring, then as a country, we're harmed. We're not going to be coming up with the best ideas, the best possible solutions. And so I think that's fundamentally why we've got to get back to this embrace of diversity. Again, look, to go back to the idea of the progressive left, the modern day op-ed launched on the pages of the New York Times in 1972. There was an editor, John Oakes, and he said, his words, "Diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we start insisting that everyone think the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy." That was a progressive viewpoint in 1972. The New York Times wanted ideas printed in their publication that were different from the ideas that their editors have. Now, flash forward to modern times and the Tom Cotton op-ed in the New York Times, and It's a very, very different thing. It is more of an enforcement of orthodoxy now. But as a country, we've got to get back to that, historically progressive embrace of diversity of views.
But it's funny, you talk about the people who work at these companies, right? And you once in a while you'll see something flare up. They are progressives. And I kind of have this view of garbage in, garbage out. And this is what worries me about AI, is that if the people creating AI or the people creating the platform at Facebook, what have you, are all from a left-leaning perspective, and I don't think that's a debatable thing. They're very open about it. They're very clear about it. Then you're going to get a left-leaning outcome, right? Left in, left out. And I think, again, that's what troubles me about AI is it starts to learn to basically censor itself, to shut out ideas, to block the ability to create. I mean, there's these tests where people ask it to create a speech on Donald Trump, and it'll say, I cannot do that because it's hate-filled or what have you. I mean, but that's the problem, is that I think fundamentally that when you look at the construct of a lot of these companies, it's all people on the left building it. And then we wonder why, there's shadow bans and censors, and they say, well, it's the algorithm. And to some extent, I kind of believe them, because I think to myself, you created that. Yeah. You told it that to do that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, look, on this issue with AI, I think we got to find what I would describe as sort of the middle bowl of porridge with regulation. We need some sort of pro-speech guardrails that are similar to the ideas that you're laying out there. How do we make sure there's not sort of political bias built into these systems? I think we can go too far. And I think, frankly, the Biden administration has. They've got this, multiple 100+ page report that looks like something I'm used to seeing out of my colleagues in Brussels, where they just overstudy things and overregulate things. So I think we should not proceed with zero regulation of AI. I don't think we should proceed with the Biden administration sort of Brussels approach of overregulating in the infancy, but we need some guardrails to make sure there isn't those types of biases in sort of political discrimination that's being imbued in these systems as they get going.
The thing that I wonder about AI, though, is that we're not the only ones that are working on it. So you have China and all these other countries, and they don't need to tell it to do certain things. So you could have us trying to regulate it in certain ways, and yet other AI applications, sort of free to do what they have, or taking direction from, say, China.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think if you flash forward, we're largely going to be, and I think sort of two parallel internet universes. There's going to be, the CCP version and perhaps everybody else. And I think this, Starlink, Starnet divide is going to be part of it. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, decoupling from China, but look, China's the one decoupling from us. They parrot our technology, they copy our technology, they steal our technologies, and then they kick our companies out. Once they've sucked them dry as much as possible. And I think you're going to see the same thing happen with AI and with the internet more generally. And again, that's, to where we started from. We got to have the backs of America's entrepreneurs, because again, if you look at Belt and Road and you start adding in Starnet on top of that, the geopolitics in 2028, when China can beam internet filter the way it likes to all of Africa, all of South America, that's going to be a really challenging world that I don't think we're preparing for sufficiently, and we're particularly not preparing for it sufficiently by this regulatory harassment of Elon Musk and his Starlink system.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that we're going to wake up one day and it's going to be too late, especially with China. One other aspect of what China's doing, though, is something that's bothered me for a long time. I know you've been very outspoken about it, is the use of TikTok. And I think it's a national security threat. I think, and it's funny because people will say to me, oh, I cannot tell you how many times somebody says to me, I don't care that they have my data. I'm not important.
Yeah, no, it's a real challenge. And so TikTok is fundamentally two issues. One is surveillance, and the second is foreign influence. On surveillance, you're right. They are scooping up, hoovering up data on millions and millions of Americans. And okay, so an individual says, what do I care? They've got my data. Like, okay, fine. But when the CCP is able to granularly comb through data for 300, potentially, hundreds of millions of Americans, they can get an insight and a perspective into our culture, into how to persuade us. That is like nothing we've seen before. And again, the second piece is foreign influence. You've seen it with the rise of sort of pro-Hamas content, but you saw it as well in our 2022 election, where they sort of targeted select politicians for criticism. And so we absolutely need to take action against TikTok, and we can do it. Look, on the broadcast side, we started talking early on about these, broadcast television license process that the FCC runs. I can assure you that the CCP ByteDance would not be able to purchase a radio or TV broadcast license without passing a national security review that they couldn't pass. And yet they're reaching orders of magnitude more people through this application than anybody ever could through an FCC license or broadcaster. So we need to look at that. But again, I think in the main, we have enough reason for action because of the data that they're taking. Look, it's like someone uses a pen and they can write the most, salacious anti-American propaganda they want. And at least in that context, the government can't take the pen. But the moment they take that pen and pick a lock with it, well, then all of a sudden we can take that pen away. And that's what's happening with TikTok. There is this foreign influence element of it, which is complicated from a First Amendment perspective. But we don't need to reach that question, because what they're doing is they're taking the data and they're sending it back to China. And that conduct, not the content, the conduct that they're doing there is more than sufficient for us to require what I call a genuine divestment, which is to get ByteDance and the CCP out of its position of control over the application.
So if you're a parent listening right now, your kid's on TikTok, what does Brendan Carr say to them as a FCC commissioner about their kids' use of it?
Look, within the first 30 minutes of accounts being set up on TikTok, there was a study cited by the New York Times that showed that the accounts were sending young girls eating disorder content, in sort of other sort of self-harm content right off the bat. And that's not the content that China is sending to its kids over the version of the app Douyin that's available in China. It's sending things like museum exhibits, science experiments, educational material. And again, parents think of this like Facebook or Instagram, where you are following a network of friends or family. That is not at all how TikTok works. As soon as an account is set up for your kid, the algorithm, the company ByteDance, which has CCP officials working for it, is deciding what content to send to your kid.
It's almost like they recognize that technology is influencing kids' development, and they make their domestic version a spinach version of TikTok, while they ship the opium version to the rest of the world.
And so it's a very different type of social media than what, parents are used to in terms of, grandma's photos on Facebook. That's not what's happening here.
Yeah. And I think for all of those reasons, people need to understand that it is not something that is appropriate for kids. And it's not about your data. It's about the influence. It's about the national security threat. Brendan, I want to ask you this. In a previous interview back a couple of years ago, you said this: since the 2016 election, the far left has hopped from hoax to hoax to hoax to explain how it lost to President Trump at the ballot box. We saw that with the Russia hoax in 2016. In 2020, you mentioned how they censored the Hunter Biden story that we now know through research and polling would have affected the outcome of a lot of people's votes. What worries you about this upcoming election?
Well, look, I do think it continues to be worrisome when you see the degree of censorship that can take place online. I think, one thing that's very different is, Elon Musk buying Twitter. I think that can make a big difference, and not because of his politics being right or left or wherever it ends up, but because he has made an ideological commitment to a diversity of views on that platform. I think that could be very helpful as we go into this election. So if you have a leftist view, you can express it. If you have a view that cuts more right, you can express it. I think having that as a free speech platform is actually some comfort for a change heading into 2024 for all political parties.
But do you worry? I mean, like the Hunter Biden story was a complete blackout. You talk about the airwaves that you guys regulate. The news organizations, quote unquote, wouldn't allow that story to be told. The platforms censored it. And yet, and as I said, we know from data now that people would have changed their vote because of that. Do you worry that these platforms, we talk about election interference, I do worry about how the news media is being used and how these platforms are being used to not just get ideas out, but prevent certain ideas that would help one candidate or another. And again, it always seems to go against the folks on the right.
Yeah, look, I'd feel much more comfortable if, for instance, the House was able to pass some type of 230 reform early next year in 2024. I feel more comfortable if there was some action taken on TikTok by the House early, this year as well here in 2024. I think those are some of the most important things that we can do to put us in a better spot, as we move forward.
Well, I do too. Unfortunately, I don't think, considering the current makeup of Congress, we're going to see anything happen. And I guess the last thing I'll ask you is, but are there consequences? That's what I think the current makeup of 230 gives these guys the cover. They know that they can't, that there's no consequences for doing what they do, meaning blocking a story, censoring a story, shadow banning people and censoring them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're getting more and more of this exposed. I think that's a good thing. We've got these state laws, Florida and Texas. They're probably going to go up to the Supreme Court. So those are areas where we are seeing some changes. And hopefully, if those cases are sustained by the Supreme Court, it does sort of set a baseline pro-speech framework, even though, those are just two states. But hopefully, other states and the platforms themselves take a clue from those state laws and have much more of an embrace of diversity of views here.
Okay. Commissioner Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. If I don't see you again, have a very happy new year. And to all of you, we got one more show left in 2023 and then onward to 2024. So join us tomorrow for another great show. Thanks for joining us. Please make sure you subscribe, hit that notification button, 5-star review on Apple. We'll see you back here tomorrow on the Sean Spicer Show. Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.